Spirit of starting to think about shared risk, or a new way of thinking about safety, a new way of thinking about risk, I've been doing this thinking about suicide and the language of suicide, or the language of, well, I'll just leave it at that for now. How that's gotten used and sort of blended into the mental health culture. As I said earlier, we're very loose about talking about feeling suicidal quite a bit. And it all of a sudden occurred to me one day, when somebody says that, often people respond with, what do? I need to do something right now. Suicidal is not a feeling, right? There's not really a feeling called suicidal. It's an action. And so we've gotten kind of used to talking about the most painful, difficult feelings in the language of suicide. And the result of that has been a direct link with assessment and evaluation. And even we as peers have gotten into that. In working in a crisis program, it occurs all the time, all the time, all the time. When do people actually call? When is it that dangerous? And we find ourselves back in that assessment mode. And I absolutely believe that this is the area we've got to tackle next in our field. Because otherwise, well, let me just say this. I'm afraid a little bit that if we don't rethink shared risk, or the notion of risk, mutual responsibility, that the liability issue will continue to drive what it is that we do ultimately. You know, the way that traditional risk is done and the assessment stuff, it will always come back to that. And then I think we'll be stuck. So I started thinking about this notion that feeling suicidal for many of us has become a reaction, a response, a learned condition, if you will. Does that resonate with people? I know, for me, I can remember early on in my life, it was a direct correlation to what I was going through and what I was experiencing. Was the way of dealing with my pain at that time was to jump from the pain and the confusion and the disaster to the possibility of doing something about it in terms of suicide. And very quickly over my life, and I suspect many of yours, I began to have very, very difficult feelings, and immediately, instead of having the feelings, moved right to sort of that suicidal thinking. Is this resonating with people? People have this experience? I think one of the best things that happened to me in my treatment, not in peer support, but in traditional treatment, was that one person that I worked with, who was an ally, her response basically was, suicide is always an option. I can't control whether you kill yourself or not. That was her response to me. And so I learned a whole lot more about a different language and getting out of that sort of dynamic of power and control. For me, talking about feeling suicidal was a way to get away from being in my skin. And as people who have had difficult times and experiences with all kinds of violence, that's not uncommon, I would say. But it's taken me so far away from being in my skin that it has become for me an either-or kind of thing. Either I'm feeling okay, or I'm suicidal. You know, it's almost that black and white. I mean, I'm not there anymore, but I think it's interesting to think about how we might talk in our peer programs about suicide as an addiction or a habit. One of the programs I've been working with has actually started this conversation, and they run a hotline or a warm line or a support line or whatever you want to call it. And so we've been asking people some different questions. And I guess I just want to say before I leave this is that the minute we get into assessment conversations, no matter how peer we are, it is the end of the mutual relationship. It is the end of negotiating. It is the end of talking about the pain, and it's the end of finding a new response. Because all we can do at that point is to either lock somebody up or not. Talk about how you're going to handle risk and dangerousness up front. What it's going to feel like, for example, before it ever happens, if one of you or the other of you says, man, I am totally out of it, I am out of control, I am feeling suicidal. How are we going to address that if and when it does come up? Can you imagine if that was one of the first conversations psychiatrists had with their patients? It would be phenomenal. You could actually figure out a response together proactively. Other responses I think that are interesting are simply to look at how long people have used that suicide language as a response or reaction. How long that's kind of been a pattern for them. And helping people really reflect at what level they've gotten away from talking about their pain, talking about the circumstances or the context or whatever it is. What is it that people want from you when they tell you they're feeling suicidal? That's a great proactive conversation to have. I remember this with a friend, actually someone with the Women in Violence Project. Years ago she said, how do you want me to respond if you say that? And we had this whole negotiation, this whole thing. She was willing to go much further with it than I was. She was way much more of a risk taker than I was. But I told her what I needed, and it was hard to think about. Because really, when I say that, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to take control. I want somebody else to take care of my pain. That's what I mean when I say I'm feeling suicidal. I think proactively, we need to be talking with each other about what happens in our relationship should we get into an assessment kind of negotiation. What's going to happen, for example, if I get terrified and have to start those wheels turning around evaluation and assessment? What's going to happen to the relationship? And how are you going to get it back on track should that happen? I mean, frankly, we've probably all had to fall into an assessment role at one time or another with our friends and colleagues, because scary stuff happens. So you talk about that proactively and how to get your relationship back on track. Now, in doing the crisis alternative stuff, I teach this whole 5-day thing and for these programs that are doing peer-run crisis stuff. And it's always fascinating to me how people deal with after the fact of an assessment kind of situation. For example, I was working with a program up in Maine. Is anybody here from Maine? No, nobody came from Maine. And they had been doing their peer-run program for some time, and there was a woman there who came in and wasn't eating. And everybody was dancing around the topic and saying, it's her choice, no it's not, she's gonna die, what should we do, but it's her choice, you know, all of the kinds of ethical conversations that you run up against. But nobody had the conversation with her in which they said, I'm scared. Nobody approached her and said, this isn't okay with me. You're not eating, you're not drinking, I'm scared. That's the relational conversation that we can have. And I'm angry, you know? We dance around each other and we walk on eggshells as if we're going to break. And in fact, we're pretty tough. So I really encourage this group to talk with each other about what it is that they feel in the relationship and to own their own stuff in that. We've got to come back to the fact that in our kind of helping relationships, both people matter. And that's really fundamental to what we're talking about, because if both people matter, then even conversations like difficult ones like that are a negotiated matter.